Subura, Rome, 73 CE. It wasn't all marble forums and clean aqueducts. This city, epicenter of empire, also harbored slums, brothels, and insulae primed to burn. We'll trace how overcrowding, grain subsidies, and post-fire rebuilding laws shaped these zones. Sources estimate 800 vigils patrolled nightly to curb theft and flame. From imperial neglect to senatorial investment, Rome's margins reveal uneasy balances of power. What happens when the world's capital thrives between crime and control? A city of marble on the surface, but teetering above splinters and soot below. The neighborhoods of ancient Rome carried more than just the burdens of their residents. What happened when the capital of empire couldn't guarantee safety a block away from its temples? In 73 CE, while Vespasian readied the foundations of his Flavian amphitheater, and the shadow of Augustus's forum still awed the visiting provinces, the Subura district pulsed with another rhythm, one of overcrowded living, reeking smoke from street-side hearths and alleys hemmed in by crumbling walls. Here amid the Esquiline slopes, and beyond the Subura's tangled lanes, Rome's poor crowded into insulae, rental blocks stacked high, and wide their wooden rafters a tinderbox above the city's cracked stone. They lived close to caged chickens, boiling surf pots, and the whispered transactions of unlicensed trade. These neighborhoods were the arterial veins of labor, porters, freedmen, tradesmen, laundresses, and yet they remained underfunded, underpoliced, and structurally unsound. The reason in part was a matter of scale. With over 1 million inhabitants by the early imperial period, Rome had outgrown its core infrastructure, but not its elite indifference. Economics drove the imbalance. Freedmen, often recent manumissions, flooded the city seeking opportunity but faced legal and social ceilings. They were citizens in name but junior in utility, licensed in labor but not in trust. The census list swelled, but meaningful legal inclusion required years or patronage networks. Rome's demography was ascending in volume, even as its capacity for integration folded inward. Multi-story insulae mushroomed wherever land remained subdividable. Through much of the Aventine and into the lower slopes of the Caelian Hill, these tenements were built quickly and rented dear. Minimal regulations governed them until Augustus, attempting to restore order after late Republican violence, created the cohorts vigilum. 7,000 night watchmen, mostly freedmen, organized into regions under a praefectus vigilum. They carried water buckets, axes, and a modicum of legal authority, yet they battled more than just flames. The majority of fires started in kitchens where pottery fractured or beams scorched. On windy nights, entire insulae could cascade into torch lines across multiple city blocks. The vigils fought both heat and human panic, often with ill-maintained cisterns or choked water supplies. Even the food supply strained against the city's unstable geography. Rome's grain needs, organized as the annona, drew logistical lifeblood from Sicily, Egypt, and particularly Africa Proconsularis. Administered through the praefectus annoni, the grain dole kept roughly 200 citizens quiet with subsidized monthly rations. But both distance and unpredictability frayed the system. Pirate disruptions or Nile floods could mean short-wait announcements in the forum, and in the Subura, rumors hit faster than officials. Panic led to crowd surges, looting, and sudden riots, which jurists wrote off as plebeian disorder rather than symptoms of policy exposure. The margin between civic tranquility and violent unrest sat on the sea lanes, unreliability. When the Great Fire of 64 CE eventually burned through 10 of Rome's 14 regions, many whispered that Nero watched from his Palatine heights in composed detachment. His rebuilding programs imposed new fire laws, building height caps, mandatory stone facades, broader thoroughfares. But codified reform met the practical limits of edilician enforcement. The municipal aediles, elected officials duty-bound to maintain urban order, could fine or shutter structures, but they lacked manpower and budget to inspect the expanding slums. loopholes abounded, and where the poor had burned property transferred, whether by sale seizure or slum clearance, into equestrian or senatorial hands. The Domus Aurea, Nero's palatial sprawl across the heart of Rome's devastation, sat as both artistic marvel and accusation. Reconstruction benefited the few, while the many returned to narrower, hidden pockets of inferno-prone housing. Yet the law hid a loophole deeper than brick. Many senators, despite aristocratic disdain for commerce, invested large sums into tenement ventures. Shielded by layers of freedmen, agents, their portfolios swelled from rent collected on collapsing foundations. Dio Cassius records repeated attempts at legislation to cap building heights and regulate urban leasing, but outcomes remained thin. When a 7-story insula collapsed and crushed residents beneath it, the asset owner seldom faced prosecution. Guilt stopped at the ostiarius, the doorman, paid to manage absent landlords' affairs. This fusion of senatorial wealth and indifference calcified over time, and the legal order meant to supply protection and redress nourished instead evasion and opacity. By the 3rd century, a more ominous architecture began to rise, the Aurelian Wall. Built between 271 and 275 CE, in response to external raids and rumors of imperial vulnerability, it encircled not only Rome's shrines, forums, and castra, but also its slums. The empire had built walls to keep enemies out, but now it had walled decay within. That wall could not contain disease, it could not subdue rage, and it could no longer guarantee that Rome's own center wouldn't soon produce the next crisis rather than receive it. Rome dazzled with its marble and monuments, but its shadows told a different story. What happens when imperial splendor rests on flammable rooftops and unpaid night patrols? In 73 CE, as construction pressed forward on the Colosseum under Emperor Vespasian, and the Forum Augustum cast long civic shadows, the Subura district simmered beneath. Tucked between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, the Subura was thick with insulae, multi-story tenements teetering onto one another. The streets choked with the aroma of fried grain, human sweat, and latrine water, while shopfronts offered everything from wine diluted with resin to illegal dice games. Here Rome's laborers, freedmen, and foreign-born tradesmen eked out survival under the looming systems of grain annona and drought-prone aqueducts. The optics of imperial peace were preserved above ground, but barely sustained below. Urban housing in these lower districts emerged not from planning but from necessity. A systemic driver, demographic growth, pressed Rome into vertical expansion. The result, thousands of insulae, particularly dense on the Esquiline and Aventine hills, constructed with haste and profit in mind. Freedmen investors acting as proxies for senatorial landowners packed wooden floors atop crumbling brick to squeeze tenants into rentable layers. The higher one lived, the cheaper and deadlier, the residents. Fires as well as structural collapse were common. The Vigils, a firefighting cohort established as part of Augustus's urban reforms, numbered around 70. Despite their mandate and their status as a semi-military force, their manual tools, buckets, hooks, pumps, were often no match for a tightly wound blaze spreading down an alley thick with oil lamps and dried grain sacks. Yet housing was only one half of the problem. The annona, Rome's state grain distribution system, drew over 200 mouths toward the capital by the late Republic, binding imperial stability to the uninterrupted shipment of Egyptian and African cereals. Overseen by the Praefectus Annani, this logistical machine relied on Mediterranean winds and the successful coordination of harbor complexes like Portus Augusti. A single delay, caused by Sicilian storms or pirate disruption near Carthage, could suspend the weekly grain dole. Food panic often began in neighborhoods like the Subura, where clients lined up at dawn near distribution tabernae. By 51 BCE, Cicero was already warning of the plebs' volatility when deprived of delivery, noting the political risk posed by a hungry, exposed urban mass. After fire destroyed large parts of Rome in 64 CE, The pattern became unmistakable. Nero's response: new building codes mandates for flammable materials to be replaced with stone stricter height limits, addressed the surface. The law, however, hid a loophole. Enforcement fell to the aediles, mid-ranking urban magistrates with limited funding and no coercive power. Thus, while aristocratic zones like the Palatine quickly rebuilt with marble and mosaic, low-lying districts recovered with the same combustible patchwork. Nero's construction of the Domus Aurea on freshly raised parcels, once filled with tenements, seeded suspicions that arms of the state benefited from disaster. Justice, too, ran unevenly. When insulae collapsed or caught fire, legal culpability rarely rose past the ostiarius, the tenement dormant. As Dio Cassius observed, laws limiting building heights or demanding safety were bypassed by landlords through freedmen intermediaries. Many senators, barred by custom from open trade, invested indirectly in rental blocks. Their motive was pragmatic. Land in Rome was finite, high yield, and through tenants, generated cash without dirtying patrician dignity. This convergence of elite profit and plebeian risk fostered deepening mistrust, especially as remedies through the courts remained symbolic at best. Even religion offered no sustained stability. As centralizing Roman temples basked in civic rituals and legal functions, the alleys of the Subura brimmed with lareria, domestic shrines, and foreign cults. Mystery religions, including followers of Mithras and Isis, thrived in rented rooms and disused warehouses. By the 3rd century, as Caracalla's edict extended citizenship to virtually all free residents of the empire, the spiritual mosaic thickened. While the gesture brought tax conformity, it also blurred civic identity. Under emperors like Decius, harsh edicts attempting to restore Sacra Publica triggered episodic crackdowns, especially in poorer wards already stressed by rent hikes and intermittent grain flow. The consequences of this urban system: infrastructure, overburdened law, both omnipotent and inert spirituality fragmented, came into sharp focus when violence erupted. In the final decades of the Republic, figures such as Clodius Pulcher weaponized collegia and urban guilds into armed factions. Though Augustus outlawed such militias, their ghost remained dormant, awaiting seizure in moments of crisis. During the civil wars following Nero's death in 68 CE, slum neighborhoods became staging grounds for plebeian riots and soldier mutinies. Imperial generosity could no longer pacify areas living beyond the reach of durable governance. And then the walls arrived. Between 271 and 275 CE, Emperor Aurelian ordered the construction of Rome's first full-circuit fortifications in centuries. Ostensibly, these defenses were drawn against Gothic incursions and threats to the northern frontier. In practice, Aurelian's wall encased a brittle interior, overcrowded flatlands, failing infrastructure, and people who had little hope in the protection of law. Securing the periphery could not resolve the instability packed within. As the 4th century advanced, and emperors fled to Ravenna or Constantinople, districts like the Subura hardened into crisis. The Senate grew, elusive grain fleets arrived sporadically, and tenement blocks buckled from rain and rot. Slums still bustled, but now beneath a sky more filled with ash than ambition. Something smoldered at the core, and Rome, its heartbeat shallow, stood vulnerable to the next blow. The Forum stood in marble silence, but down the slope past the sacred line of the Pomerium, and beneath the gaze of gilded Capitoline gods, Rome's other face simmered in the Subura. It was the year 73 CE. Vespasian had recently begun construction on the Colosseum, a gift to the plebs Romana following the restitution of order after Nero's demise. Yet only a few streets away, in densely packed tenements of the Caelian and Esquiline Hills order, was a relative term. The Subura district, wedged between urban grandeur and administrative neglect, had long been an engine for street-level Rome, home to butchers, cloth dyers, freedmen, prostitutes, and itinerant vendors. Its insulae, the multi-storied apartment blocks that filled every alley, revealed the core challenge of Rome's imperial capital: how to house, feed, and police over 1 million people ruled by elites who rarely passed through these quarters except in records or voting tallies. Demography drove the crisis. As grain flowed to the capital under the Annona system, from fields in Africa proconsularis and via shipments overseen by the Praefectus Annani, Rome's poor came to depend entirely on state dole. By the time of Caesar's reforms, over 200 male citizens were registered recipients. The promise of bread without tax lured thousands to the capital, ex-soldiers, without land, freedmen seeking patronage, and provincials drawn into the margins of citizenship. But cheap housing lagged far behind. Landlords, including many senators who massed property through freedmen managers, responded by throwing up insulae as rapidly and cheaply as possible. Constructed with timber beams and unreinforced brick, they climbed 5 or 6 stories high, leaning precariously over narrow streets barely wide enough for carts. Fire was both frequent and feared. In 64 CE under Nero, a catastrophic blaze consumed 10 out of Rome's 14 regions. The blaze likely began near the Circus Maximus, but spread rapidly through Subura, Palladium, and Caelian slopes, where housing density and wood construction made disaster inevitable. Nero's response included introducing fireproofing ordinances, limiting building height, mandating stone construction, and widening streets to act as fire breaks. But enforcement fell to the aediles, local officials often burdened with political obligations rather than architectures of safety. Privately land acquisition followed. Charred lots were absorbed by elites or the emperor himself. On the ashes of former homes, Nero commissioned the Domus Aurea, his private golden palace. Public memory turned bitter. Rumors soon spread that the fire had been encouraged, not fought. Security came at night, but thinly. The vigils, Rome's nocturnal fire patrol and night watch, numbered around 70, organized in 7 cohorts stationed across the city. These were not legionaries, but freedmen armed with axes, buckets, and status only slightly above laborers. Their task was impossible. Even with reform, the vigils faced flammable tenements, hostile crowds, and vast mazes of alleys where warning voices vanished into smoke before help could arrive. Yet the law hid a loophole deeper than the flames. Ossuarii caretakers or doormen bore the immediate blame when buildings collapsed or burned. Legal and financial responsibility rarely reached the senatorial landlords whose wealth derived from precisely such ventures. Dio Cassius preserves trace of repeated legislation trying to curb insulae height and coerce owners into repairs, but enforcement was selective and corruption common. In practice, the line between investor and magistrate blurred. The urban poor, meanwhile, turned inward. Collegia, professional guilds of bakers, smiths, even actors, offered mutual aid, burials, and protection. Some became political instruments, especially in the late Republic. But in the harsher decades of the empire, they operated in liminal zones between legality and gang control. Importantly, spiritual life adapted as well. Shrines clustered in doorways and cults of Mithras or Isis found foothold in basement sanctuaries within insulae. Religion, like brick, was a species of adaptation. By the 3rd century, Rome threw up another wall, Aurelian's Wall, constructed between 271 and 275 CE, encircled not just triumphal arches and cohort barracks, but also the insalubrious core, fetid alleyways prone to fire, hunger, riots, and plague. Bureaucratically, the wall marked final concession that danger no longer only came from beyond the empire's frontiers, but within tensions still festered. The Subura endured, shabbier, more crowded, forgotten by an elite drifting toward provincial estates and eastern capitals. The marble city remained the image of Rome. The other Rome remained combustible. A city of marble, but it stank of smoke. The slums of Rome were never far from flame or fury. In 73 CE, as the Colosseum's foundations cracked the soil, and the Temple of Peace crowned the forum's eastern flank. A very different Rome pulsed in the alleys behind. The Subura district, wedged between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, was a hive of rented rooms, taverns, brothels, and shrines blackened by soot. Overcrowded and under-policed, its twisting lanes bore an economy of speed and scarcity, laborers buying bread before dawn, freedmen hawking, whereas foreign cults meeting by candlelight. Beneath the imperial spectacle, the bulk of the capital's 1 million souls lived in fire-prone tenements and survived by improvisation. The systemic driver was demography. A Rome reliant on grain shipments and enslaved labor became a city addicted to sheer presence of bodies to staff bathhouses, press oil, haul amphorae, and fill amphitheaters. To house them, landlords raised insulae, often 5 or 6 stories, stacking wooden beams above unbaked brick. Rents rose the higher one climbed, along with danger. On windy nights or festive eves, a dropped oil lamp might bring down a whole block. Augustus, facing a city where even senators feared their domus fringed disorder, created the cohorts vigilum, 70 freedmen organized to patrol at night armed with buckets, ladders, and axes. Yet the vigils reported to the praefectus vigilum, a role nested within a sprawling and underfunded urban machinery. The Arc of Fire continued its advance, but fire was not the only famine stalking the Subura. The Annona, the grain distribution system, offered subsidized wheat to hundreds of thousands of citizens. No longer symbolic, it was the mainspring of urban calm. Directed by the praefectus Annoni, the system depended on African grain fleets and Horia storage depots like the Horia Galbana and Agripiana, whose strategic positions along the Tiber turned them into logistical chokepoints. A delayed convoy due to Libyan storms or pirate clusters near Sicily could mean riot. In 51 BCE, Cicero warned the Senate that the plebs urbana were more sensitive to bread than politics. Grain scarcity translated into stones hurled at magistrates. After catastrophe came opportunity, but not for the poor. In July 64 CE, a fire started in the shops beneath the Circus Maximus. Within 6 days, 10 of Rome's 14 regions were charred, and the Capitoline wind carried smoke from the Subura to the Janiculum. Emperor Nero's response reshaped the city. New codes mandated wider streets, stone walls, and capped building heights. Implementation rested on aediles and contractor liens, but enforcement faded in low-income wards. What cleared space for reform also cleared tenants. Land expropriations, often justified as safety measures, transferred hectares of ruined insulae into senatorial or imperial hands. The Domus Aurea rose where thousands had once rented, and trust between emperor and urban poor sank into ash. Yet the law hit a loophole. Even when buildings collapsed, legal culpability rarely climbed above the Asharius, the lowly doorkeeper. Landowners, often senators, laundered their holdings through freedmen. Livy and later Dio Cassius observed how laws to curb construction abuses were drafted, but rarely enforced. Logistics played its hand again, with no central registry for property under the Republic. Ownership claims could be obfuscated. As Rome densified, so did its shadow economies, of tenancy, of patronage, of silence. Meanwhile, other strains surfaced. Alongside household larraria stood imperial cult, altars, shrines to Isis, and neighborhoods claiming the favor of Mithras. The Sacra Publica, rites supporting the state gods, now competed with foreign and mystery religions thriving in borrowed spaces. Under Emperor Decius, whose edicts demanded empire-wide sacrifices to state gods, sporadic purges of divergent sects erupted in slum districts. For those already displaced by fire or debt, forced confession by local officials tipped urban tension into blood. The empire's center found itself defining civic unity, not just against external foes but internally, street by street. By the mid-3rd century, Aurelian's decision to construct a new city wall reflected not just military apprehension, but internal acknowledgement Rome's sprawl needed containment. Planned between 271 and 275 CE. The Aurelian Wall encircled both the monuments of imperial identity and the squalor of collapsing insulae. Sections of the Subura and Esquiline, once considered marginal, were now strategically enclosed. But walls could not kill mold in crumbling cisterns or pacify hunger. Instead, they enclosed a capital bent under its own density. Even as late as the 4th century, when Constantinople rose and senatorial villas bloomed beyond the Tiber, the inner districts rotted. Urban prefects charged nominally with order commanded crumbling files and too few staff. Ordinances lapsed. Subura's alleys narrowed with filth. Sewers backed into basements. And in neglected corners, whispers stirred of gods who promised bread, fire from heaven, or justice. Just beyond the marble temples and triumphal arches of Rome's sacred core lived a different empire, one of collapsing walls, seething tensions, and improvised survival. Rome's glory rose from concrete and conquest, but its weight bore most heavily on the tenements of the Subura and the shadowed alleys of the Esquiline. How did the world's most powerful city come to harbor its own failure within its gates? By 73 CE, the Subura district, nestled awkwardly between the Quirinal and Viminal hills, functioned not as an aberration, but as Rome's urban engine room, smoke-choked, deafening, and dense beyond reason. There, among the noisy tabernae and rickety insulae, streamed the thousands who kept the capital breathing: porters, bakers, prostitutes, firemen, freedmen. As imperial administration expanded with census rolls and ever more complex magistracies, its reliance on this tier deepened. But spatially and legally, it stood barely contained. The economic driver was simple labor, was cheap, land was scarce, and Rome's appetite for spectacle and imported grain dwarfed civic investment. The insulae, multi-story rental blocks, towered precariously over cramped courtyards, often 4 or 5 levels of timber and neglect. Districts like the Caelian and Aventine grew, congested with these tenements thrown up swiftly by speculators in pursuit of rent. The law pressed into service under Augustus, with the Lex Iulia de Urb Ordinanda, tried to impose a building height limit, but senatorial landlords dodged restrictions through frontmen. Freedmen acting as ostensible owners, insulating senatorial capital from legal retribution when tragedies struck. Flames swept these neighborhoods repeatedly. The Vigils, a 70-strong corps reorganized under Augustus and drawn largely from freedmen, served as firefighters, watchmen, and order keepers. With buckets, axes, and modest authority, they stood between the city and post-midnight immolation. But their reach rarely extended into the narrowest alleys. Expectation had outgrown infrastructure. Rome's sheer volume of mouths fed the instability. The annona, or state grain distribution, refined under Caesar and systematized later, served over 200 plebeians, stretching supply lines from Egypt and North Africa. The office of Praefectus Annani became essential to imperial security. Even a modest delay in grain convoys could ignite panic. In the lower quarters, hunger moved faster than law. Cicero, writing in 51 BCE, described a city held together by bread and fear. Riots were brief but frequent, typically starting in slum markets or near the porticus minutia, where dura panis, hard grain rations, were handed out. Then in 64 CE, fire tore through the heart of the city. 10 of Rome's 14 regions burned. Rumors clung to Nero like soot that he watched from Maecenas Tower or played the cithara while the city choked. Whatever the truth, his rebuilding campaign was swift. Wide streets, minimum spacing between buildings, and mandated stone construction were ordered under new fireproofing codes. But enforcement again fell to the aediles, whose resources paled before Rome's terrain and density. Where the fires cleared land, imperial ambition often followed. Nero's Domus Aurea rose on territory, once packed with insulae, and distrust grew. Disaster had not benefited the victims but the powerful. In this volatile environment, the collegia, the trade associations, and neighborhood guilds took on hybrid roles. Ostensibly for burial and fellowship, many offered defense, employment networks, and increasingly muscle. Some were banned outright, viewed as proto-gangs capable of fomenting riot. But bans achieved little. Clodius Pulcher, in the waning days of the Republic, had already weaponized collegia, turning street violence into a layer of political strategy. Augustan legislation tried to suppress their militarization, yet they re-emerged in flashpoints throughout the 1st century, as conferral of citizenship widened, culminating in Caracalla's 212 CE Constitutio Antoniniana. Rome's margins absorbed new identities, legal ambiguities, and displaced grievances. Religions too clustered along these thresholds. Amid dog-infested stairwells and makeshift shrines, the cults of Mithras and Isis gained traction. Household lyraria were joined by Eastern importations that shunned the forum's prescribed rituals. The Christian community, by the mid-3rd century, had carved subterranean networks in response to sporadic state crackdowns, most notably under Decius between 249 and 251 CE. The urban poor converted not from theology, but through community healing and material support. And in doing so, they added another point of friction with civic religion. Yet the law hit a loophole. The owners of Rome's slums, often senators or equestrians, remained shielded from accountability. Dio Cassius and the jurists of the Severan era recorded how fines for collapsed buildings or negligent maintenance rarely reached above the position of the Ostiarius, the doorkeeper. As rents rose and protections slipped, resentment fed unrest. Emperors like Trajan attempted housing reforms, but with little lasting impact. Profit held stronger than pity. By the time Aurelian's wall circled the city in the late 3rd century, it enclosed not only monuments and soldiers, but an internal decay that no fortification could expel. Amid external invasion and economic contraction, the city's poorest districts, still dense, still combustible, remained Rome's most persistent failure. And as senatorial attention shifted outward and eastward, those streets pulsed with the knowledge the real collapse might not come from the frontier at all, but from within. What does the heart of empire look like when it turns in on itself? Rome's glory was built on conquest, but its survival depended on feeding and containing its own streets. In 73 CE, as Vespasian raised the Colosseum on the ruins of Nero's private palace, another Rome clung to the slopes north of the Forum, the Subura. Cramped, volatile, and teeming with freedmen, foreigners, and urban laborers, it was the unspoken engine of the capital. Here, above shared latrines and beneath collapsing roofs, lived the bulk of the city's inhabitants. Producers, porters, and port society migrants, granted only the thinnest veneer of legitimacy. Their presence reflected a systemic truth: Rome's imperial wealth depended on drawing in outsiders, licensing them through manumission, and housing them as cheaply and densely as possible. Rome's grain flows shaped its demography with brutal clarity. The annona system, administered by the Praefectus Annoni since Augustus's time, ensured regular grain rations for as many as 200 registered recipients by the mid-1st century BCE. Attracting freemen and migrants from across the empire, this created a feedback loop of dependency, density, and unrest. When a North African storm disrupted shipping schedules or pirates prowled the Sicilian approach routes, tension rose first in the slum districts. In 51 BCE, Cicero, speaking as governor of Cilicia, warned against disconnecting provincial logistics from domestic grain was no longer just a commodity, but an instrument of urban control. Yet control was fragile. The insulae, Rome's towering apartment blocks, stood as symbols of provisioning success and systemic neglect. In districts like the Esquiline and Aventine, multi-story structures, often built by absentee landlords using wooden beams, crumbling clay mortar, and unstandardized plans, threatened collapse at any hour. The vigils, a firefighting and night watch force of around 70 freedmen formed under Augustus, bore the brunt of nightly alarms. Their limited coverage, however, revealed the deeper problem. Rome managed its risks through improvisation, not proactive infrastructure. Nowhere did this become more obvious than in 64 CE. The Great Fire, which consumed 10 of the city's 14 regions, irreversibly altered the social geography. Emperor Nero answered with fire codes, mandating wider streets, erecting height limits, and requiring stone facades. But implementation depended on local aediles whose jurisdiction faded in poorer quarters. The sudden clearance of devastated land became opportunity parcels were quietly absorbed into elite and imperial holdings. When Nero began construction of the immense Domus Aurea on land, once crammed with slum tenements, the optics were catastrophic. For many Romans, it was not the fire, but the displacement that followed which marked the true scandal. Amid collapsed buildings and scorched streets, the old rhythms of urban religion broke down. As Sacra Publica lost its hold, residents turned to Lararia Eastern cults and private devotions in clandestine basements and alley shrines. Mystery cults like those of Mithras and Isis flourished. So too did Christianity, still underground, often illegal, yet unmistakably rooted in the city's tenement blocks. When Emperor Decius instituted mortal tests of civic loyalty through temple sacrifices in 250 CE, it wasn't senators but slum dwellers who drew the lines and bore the consequences. His purges destabilized not just religion but the trust between Rome's rulers and its masses. Property itself proved a core contradiction. Roman senators, bound by custom to disdain commerce, nonetheless invested heavily, though indirectly, in rental housing. Many cloaked their ownership through freedmen brokers, sidestepping reputational damage while chasing urban profit. Dio Cassius notes repeated legal attempts to curtail abuses, limits on building height, restrictions on eviction practices. Yet these statutes were hollow when the Ostiarius, the dormant caretaker, became the scapegoat after each collapse. Legal redress faltered where patronage networks protected absent landlords, reinforcing an informal economy of survival within the city's poorest zones. Yet the law hid a loophole. Collegia, formally recognized associations of craftsmen and tradesmen, these were indispensable for organizing burial rites and mutual aid. But in the pact, neighborhoods, especially after manumitted slaves and provincial migrants gained the franchise under the Edict of Caracalla in 212 CE, collegia became as much protection rackets as fraternal societies. Banned and reinstated in cycles, they offered muscle surveillance and rapid mobilization. In the late Republic, Clodius Pulcher weaponized them as street militias. Under the Empire, they remained latent forces easily reactivated in times of riot or regime collapse. And collapse loomed. By the 270 CE Emperor Aurelian responded to mounting barbarian threats by enclosing the city with a wall. But the wall did not separate Rome from the world. It trapped its contradictions inside. The core of the empire now sat in a bowl of flammable rooftops, stressed aqueducts, unswept drains, and overcrowded alleys. Disease fed on filth, food shortages, bread looting, loyalty frayed with every missed ration. The imperial palace, increasingly fortified and inaccessible, sat less like a guardian than a citadel. The centuries ahead would not see suburban renewal but senatorial withdrawal. Villas along the Tiber and estates in Campania drew elite attention, while urban prefects faced dwindling budgets and expanding fires. With Constantinople rising in the east and the Western court migrating from Milan to Ravenna, Rome's center rotted not from betrayal but abandonment. Behind the marble forums and triumphal archways smoldered a capital ungoverned, held together by habit, fear, and the memory of order. Even in an empire of marble temples and imperial forums, Rome's poor lived in neighborhoods where gods were close, walls leaned inward, and law came late, if at all. What did it mean to maintain the capital's dignity when its shadow world simmered just a few passos from the Senate House? In the year 73 CE, amid the public celebrations for Vespasian's new Flavian amphitheater, the district of the Subura churned with bodies, smoke, and refuse. Tucked in the low-lying saddle between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, this quarter was both essential and feared. It was where stonecutters lived next to prostitutes, where freed slaves opened taverns under tenements 6 stories high, and where the pulse of labor made the city function but rarely ruled. The crowds of the Subura were not voiceless. They screamed, brawled, worshipped, and rioted. But they rarely chose the path of Rome. More often, they felt its weight. One reason was demography. Between the wars of Sulla and Nero, the capital's population ballooned, boosted by freedmen drawn to the Annona Rome state-run grain dole. By the late Republic, over 200 souls were registered to receive grain under the supervision of the Praefectus Annani, a post that merged logistics and civic control. This reliance meant that grain shortages, delayed African fleets' piracy along the Tyrrhenian crop failures in Sicily, translated swiftly into unrest. In 51 BCE, Cicero warned the Senate that the plebs urbana, if denied panem, would undermine republic and order. It was not hyperbole. With survival tethered to distant ports, and whether hunger in districts like the Subura could turn into explosion. To shelter this mass, Rome permitted the rise of insulae, multi-story rental blocks of brick, timber, and risk. These structures, clustered especially on the Esquiline and Aventine hills, were quick to burn, quicker to collapse, and deadly in both cases. Augustus attempted to institutionalize safety through the vigils, a corps of 70 freedmen charged with night patrols, fire control, and minor policing. Their presence was meant to stabilize, yet their meager equipment, mostly buckets, axes, and basic water pumps, exposed the limitations of Republican infrastructure grafted onto an imperial capital. When fire came, as it did in 64 CA, it took much more than a watchman's bucket. Nero's response was sweeping. He ordered wider streets, capped building heights, and insisted on non-flammable construction. The new codes fell under the jurisdiction of the aediles, yet their reach rarely extended into alleyways thick with smoke and despair. Reconstruction after the Great Fire displaced thousands. Aristocrats acquired fire-cleared plots at reduced price, and Nero perhaps most provocatively claimed vast tracts for his Domus Aurea. Official records stressed reform, but the lived experience of many Romans saw only land seizure and permanent exclusion. After all, laws only mattered where law could walk. Yet the law hid a loophole: ownership. The senatorial class officially scorned commerce, but many cloaked their profits behind freedmen managers. From these slumlords, insulae yielded high rental returns with little liability. When buildings collapsed, responsibility often halted at the Asciarius, the doorkeeper. As Dio Cassius observed, laws were passed repeatedly, but always with exceptions, dilutions, or quiet repeal. The Roman legal system, precise in text, failed in enforcement. Urban poverty existed not outside the empire's power but within it, as a tolerated yield of patrician gain. And into this combustible space entered transformation. Forbidden collegia, once only trade federations, evolved into street gangs and protection rackets. In the time of Clodius Pulcher, they became political instruments, deploying violence under the guise of civic fervor. Augustus outlawed such assemblies, but their memory lingered in back streets. Meanwhile, cults and new faiths, Mithras, Isis, Christianity, took root among the desperate. These were not simply religions, but rival claims to meaning, loyalty, and identity. Under the Decian persecutions in the mid-3rd century, imperial anxiety over these gods in the gutter turned violent. Sacra publica and divine temple rites could not compete with personal salvation promised in filthy tenements. All the while, the city squeezed inward. Under Aurelian, the construction of a defensive circuit, what became the Aurelian Wall, enclosed not only the capital and Principia, but Rome's festering underside. Built between 271 and 275 CE, the wall was over 19 kilometers long, a declaration that the mighty city no longer assumed safety. But it also trapped the poverty it had failed to disperse. Slum density drove up disease and grain shipments. So long, the empire's logistical pride began to falter, with the port management under strain even at key sites like Portus Augusti. By the 4th century, the rich had left. Villas dotting Latium or estates in Africa became the preferred sites of senatorial life, What remained in the Subura was not only hardship but administrative inertia. The urban prefects still tried to enforce ordinances, but with the imperial court drawn increasingly east to Constantinople, the western capital decayed from the inside. Shrines crumbled, streets flooded with sewage, tenements reset into slums. The beating heart of empire lay rotting behind its own walls, while the frontiers and soon the gates began to crack. Paved in filth and politics, the alleys of ancient Rome ran with more than water. The empire's greatness was built atop unstable ground, and the cracks widened beneath its own capital. By 73 CE, Rome stood immense, imperial, and divided, its marble facades deceiving the eye. At the heart of the world's greatest city, only streets away from the Forum of Augustus, and the white gleam of Vespasian's amphitheater sprawled the Subura. Here the urban density pressed inward like a fist. Smoke from hearths and forges choked the air while curses' footsteps and the clatter of wheels filled every waking hour. This was not mythic Rome, this was the Rome that housed the laborers, freedmen, and itinerants who moved the city's engines. And while the streets overflowed with life, they also brimmed with dangers the Senate preferred not to see. The rise of this quarter, alongside others like it on the Esquiline, Aventine, and Caelian hills, was driven by an underlying tension: demography outpacing infrastructure. Rome's population, hungry for cheap accommodation, gave rise to insulae, multi-story apartment blocks that scraped the limits of safety. Constructed rapidly and economically, wooden joists crumbling brick reused materials, these dwellings often collapsed or burned with little warning. Fire was a constant specter. Augustus, sensing both the physical and political threat, established the cohorts vigilum, 7,000 freedmen struck from the slave population, tasked with fire response and nocturnal policing. They carried axes and buckets, but their powers stopped short of systemic reform. In dangerous corners, the vigils were more beacon than barrier. Yet it was not only fire that haunted Rome's underclass. The annona, the grain distribution that kept over 200,000 mouths fed, served as both lifeline and point of leverage. Administered by the Praefectus Annani from central offices clustered near the Tiber's docks, this system tethered the city to the harvests of Africa and Sicily. A single storm or piratical delay could leave neighborhoods like the Subura swarmed with unrest. Pliny the Younger later echoed a sentiment already feared in Cicero's day: grain kept the poor docile, but when it stopped, so did the illusion of control. Rome imported calm by the shipload, and exile stared inward whenever those ships failed to appear. Street crime bred in the gaps left by overburdened magistrates. In popular venues like the Circus Maximus, or along the foot of the Caelian, cut-purses, racketeers, and gang leaders thrived in loose networks shielded by neighborhood loyalties. Collegia, the trade guilds often acting as both employer and enforcer, blurred boundaries between legal enterprise and protection racket, though periodically banned, their presence persisted. When Caracalla's edict of 212 CE extended citizenship to nearly every free man in the empire, it further strained these hybrid systems. Legally enfranchised but economically excluded new citizens joined an old city that lacked the administrative will to reabsorb them. Meanwhile, the senatorial class, draped in togas and disdain for commerce, quietly profited from the same slums they derided. Laws capping insulae height or requiring masonry reinforcements were drafted, but enforcement splintered at the level of the aediles. Wealthy property owners simply employed freedmen as brokers and evaded scrutiny. When unsafe buildings collapsed, fines reached no higher than the doorkeeper. Administrative inertia, fueled by economic incentives and juridical ambiguities, hardened the walls between rich and poor even as they lived beside each other. One might expect religion to offer relief, but the imperial cult held little solace in these quarters. Instead, Lyraria at street-level shrines to Serapis or Isis, even covert gatherings of Christians provided fleeting ritual order. Decius's edict of 249 CE demanding empire-wide sacrifices to the gods turned faith into fault lines. Sporadic arrests and executions followed, especially in the tenement zones where unorthodox creeds had taken root. The state's inability to control how Romans worshipped mirrored its deeper fear that control itself was becoming a fiction, especially in these neighborhoods. A century after Nero blamed the Christians for a fire that exposed the city's rot, those same districts remained prone to riot, flood, and collapse. And though Aurelian would wrap the capital in new walls by the 270s, he could not enclose its deeper fractures. The core of Rome smoldered on, crowded, combustible, and watching. In the grand mosaic of Augustan marble and triumphant arches, there were streets in Rome where order collapsed into a different reality. From the Esquiline's smoky lanes to the narrow alleys off the Velabrum, whole districts teetered between subsistence and fire, law and predation. The metropolis, praised for its baths and orators, also hid swarming insulae where walls cracked, roofs leaked, and the divine shared space with the desperate. But here's the catch: this chaos wasn't a failure of Roman planning. It was in many ways its inevitable outcome. By the mid-1st century CE, Rome's population had expanded beyond 1 million, fed by conquest, manumission, and the magnetism of imperial patronage. The systemic driver was demography, a vortex of migration from the province's manumitted slaves seeking work and rural Italians chasing the annona, the state grain dole administered by the Praefectus Annanae. But this influx overwhelmed city planning. Narrow lanes, combustible tenement blocks, and the nightly terrors of collapse or theft became the lived reality for much of the plebs urbana. Nowhere captured this tension more starkly than the Subura. A dense wedge pressed between the Forum and the Esquiline, the Subura festered with carpenters' shops, wine taverns, brothels, and shrines. High insulae, 4, sometimes 5 stories, were shored up with timber supports and rented piecemeal. Wealthy landowners, many of them senators cloaked in indirect investments, exploited a housing market they would never sleep in. The logistics of housing were outsourced through freedmen intermediaries who in turn paid poorly for maintenance. Fires flashed often. In 24 BCE, Augustus created the cohorts vigilum, night watchmen of some 70 freedmen tasked with patrolling the darkened city with buckets, hooks, and axes. But even with this first fire brigade, many precincts remained chronically at risk. On the Aventine, where poor freedmen and immigrant tradesmen clustered under cheap roofs, every cart spark or kitchen flame threatened catastrophe. When famine struck or shipment delays disrupted the grain supply, tension rose. The annona, sourced largely from Sicilian and North African ports like Portus Augusti, sustained Rome's plebeian stability. Any interruption, storms off Ostia, pirates along the Sicilian Channel, translated into food queues down the Vicus Tuscus, then unrest. Cicero, confronting exactly such volatility in 51 BCE, warned that hunger made the citizenry dangerous, a blunt recognition that urban tranquility in Rome now depended less on virtue and more on logistics. Yet the law hid a loophole: building codes and tenancy protections passed under emperors like Tiberius or Trajan were rarely enforced in Rome's poorest areas. Aediles, the junior magistrates nominally responsible for urban maintenance, lacked the staff or authority to compel elite compliance. When an insula collapsed, the osciarius or doorkeeper might face interrogation, the senatorial owner rarely. Commodus and his successors flirted with oversight, but speculation continued, feeding both elite profit and structural degradation. Above ground, the spiritual instability mirrored the physical one. As official rituals in the Capitol and the Forum celebrated the Sacra Publica, new cults proliferated in the city's shadows. Mithras was worshipped in cellar crypts beneath warehouses. The goddess Isis drew initiates among the dockworkers of the Emporium. And by the mid-3rd century, Christianity, still marginal but spreading, became both a solace and a threat. Under Decius, imperial persecution escalated, targeting especially poor urban districts thick with suspected converts. The problem was not just religion, but fragmentation. Rome's civic order, once based on shared rights and visible hierarchy, splintered into a mosaic of insular affiliations. Meanwhile, the wall that should have defined safety arrived too late. Between 271 and 275 CE, Emperor Aurelian ordered the construction of a massive circuit, the Muri Orleani. Stretched nearly 19 kilometers around the capital, it included not just monuments and arsenals, but districts long considered ungovernable. By then, internal disease flowed with external threat. Plague bred where latrines failed. Water flowed inconsistently beyond the Caelian. Urban prefects struggled to keep roads passable and sewers functioning. The elite retreating to coastal villas or provincial estates left behind wards where state presence flickered and crime took root. The core of Rome still pulsed with power, but it was increasingly hollowed. As the empire strained under barbarian pressure and administrative duplication from Constantinople's streets like those of the Subura became signs not simply of urban poverty, but of imperial overreach folding in on itself. Next came the test no wall could hold back, when loyalty frayed not from invasion, but from within. Not every Roman neighborhood smelt of incense and marble. Some stank of smoke, sewage, and rot, but kept the capital breathing despite it all. How long could survival outweigh safety? In the year 73 CE, as the Flavian emperors poured funds into their new amphitheater beside the Velia and marble glittered in the Forum of Augustus, another Rome sprawled beyond the temples and tabernae. In the low streets of the Subura east of the Argiltum, the city sounded different, louder, more urgent. Vendors shouted over each other, steam rose from boiling vats of cheap bean porridge, and above it all loomed teetering insulae, the crumbling rental blocks that housed the majority of Rome's population. This was not the Rome captured in triumphal reliefs or honorific inscriptions. But it was Rome nonetheless, the indispensable underlayer of laboring bodies that stoked its furnaces, offloaded ships at Portus Augusti, and ensured the capital's fragile logistics ran from grain to sewer. Demography was the systemic driver. The capital's draw, amplified by the annona, the state's grain distribution, created an unrelenting migration inward. By the time of Caesar's reforms, some 200 plebeians were registered to receive subsidized grain overseen by the praefectus Annanae. These numbers only grew as freed slaves, rural poor, and new provincials, licensed citizens after Caracalla's edict in 212 CE, flocked to the city. Housing them fell not to the state but to private enterprise. Senators, despite their formal disdain for commerce, created vast property portfolios hidden behind the names of their liberty. Insulae sprang up on any available slope of the Esquiline Caelian or Aventine hills, often violating codes meant to limit their height or proximity. Built of cheap concrete, timber, and hope, they burned often and collapsed more than Rome's courts could document. Augustus, who had once styled himself as the city's restorer, created the vigils in response. 7,000 freedmen organized under tribunes bearing water buckets, axes, and limited imperium to suppress fires and nocturnal unrest. But the vigils, even at peak strength, struggled to enforce order over Rome's tangled alleyways where crime, smoke, and superstitio mingled freely. After the Great Fire in 64 CE, an enduring point of suspicion even within imperial propaganda, Nero imposed reconstruction statutes, increased street widths, fireproof masonry, maximum building heights. Yet enforcement again fell to municipal aediles whose jurisdiction ended where the willingness to bribe began. Land once housing hundreds became open space for the Domus Aurea. But structural hazards were not the only threat. The neighborhoods most reliant on the grain dole also stood closest to riot. When shipments from Africa delayed, due to weather or pirate interference, panic spread rapidly. These were the very port geographies developed on imperial and private land, especially near Portus Augusti, a logistical hub whose performance linked distant harvests with Rome's stomach. The optics of hunger-mattered emperors stood not only as commanders but as nourishers, in a word as trough. When that image cracked unrest from the alleys of the Subura, or the Tiber's western quays pressed outward. In 51 BCE, Cicero warned that the plebs urbana, once hungry, heard the beat of riot more clearly than rhetoric. Yet the law hid a loophole. When a tenement collapsed, crushing a family within or setting fire to an entire vicus, blame rarely traveled beyond the ossuarius, the building's doorman. Legal shields reinforced by senatorial impunity and the technical ownership by freed agents rendered upward accountability elusive. Even emperors sympathetic to reform like Trajan struggled to contain the inherent contradictions to be provider and landlord, lawgiver and beneficiary. Collapsing structures were not just hazards, they were symbols of an empire's unreadable priorities. In these quarters, civic identity diluted. As state cults dominated the Capitoline Lauraria, huddled in insulae stairwells and Eastern rites, Mithras Isis Christ claimed the spiritual space abandoned by elite indifference. By the mid-3rd century, same streets housed both oracles and thieves, vigilante collegia, and imperial fugitives. With the construction of Aurelian's Wall between 271 and 275 CE, these neighborhoods were drawn into the city's final defensive perimeter. Yet walls could not silence discontent. Food, faith, fire, all now walked the same alleys. The marble Rome gleamed still, but behind it the smolder never ceased. Whether from instability of housing proximity to port supply chains or entangled social contradictions, the city's core grew brittle. And with provincial governors gaining power and emperors turning east, that brittleness would soon face its breaking point.